The strikes carried out between April 27 and April 28 reached a point where the Kremlin acknowledged their impact. And the location at the center of that acknowledgement was the Tuapse Oil Refinery. That is the confirmed development described in the report. A Ukrainian strike campaign directed at the refinery created consequences significant enough that the Kremlin publicly recognized the effects. The wording of that statement matters carefully. Not speculation, not unofficial discussion. Acknowledgement, and in wartime reporting, acknowledgement from a government involved in active conflict can carry unusual weight, particularly when connected to infrastructure tied to energy production. The report itself is concise, but the implications inside the wording are substantial because the focus is not simply that strikes occurred. The report specifically states that the impacts of the Ukrainian strikes compelled the Kremlin to acknowledge them. That sequence matters. Strikes first, effects second, acknowledgement afterward, and sometimes in wartime communication, the order of events says almost everything. The Tuapse Oil Refinery has now become associated directly with this particular development. The report does not describe operational details of the strike itself. It does not specify the weapons involved. It does not describe damage assessments. It does not provide casualty figures or technical production disruptions. Instead, the focus remains narrowly fixed on one outcome. The impacts became impossible for the Kremlin to avoid acknowledging publicly. That narrow framing creates a very distinct tone, because governments engaged in wartime messaging often choose language carefully. Statements are measured, admissions are selective. Public recognition of successful strikes against important infrastructure can therefore become notable simply because acknowledgement occurred at all. Sometimes the shortest reports carry the sharpest edges, and this one is built almost entirely around one idea. The strikes mattered enough that official acknowledgement followed. The phrase compelled the Kremlin also carries significance in its construction. It suggests pressure created by the consequences of the strikes themselves. Not voluntary commentary, not routine discussion, but acknowledgement driven by the visible or undeniable nature of the impact. Again, the report does not expand beyond that. And because the factual boundaries here are strict, the script remains exactly within those confirmed lines. April 27 to April 28th, Ukrainian strikes. Tuapse Oil Refinery, Kremlin acknowledgement of impacts. That is the documented framework. And yet inside that framework sits a larger atmosphere of tension surrounding wartime infrastructure. Oil refineries are industrial sites deeply connected to energy systems. They are operational facilities with strategic significance. And when strikes against such locations result in public acknowledgement from the Kremlin, the reporting naturally draws attention, not because additional interpretation is inserted, but because the acknowledgement itself becomes the central development. The report does not describe the Kremlin's tone. It does not quote officials directly. It does not characterize internal reactions, only the fact that acknowledgement occurred. And sometimes factual restraint creates its own intensity because viewers and readers recognize how unusual public admissions can become during conflict conditions. There is also something striking about the timing window described here. April 27th to April 28th, a relatively short period. Overnight actions unfolding rapidly enough that the resulting impacts entered official recognition afterward. That compressed timeline gives the report momentum even without dramatic language. One action leading directly into another. Strike, impact, acknowledgement. The structure almost reads like a chain reaction. The moment something can no longer be ignored, silence changes. That feeling hangs quietly underneath this report, not because the article states it emotionally, but because acknowledgement itself becomes the defining event. And in wartime communication, acknowledgement often carries layers beyond the initial action. The refinery itself now occupies a very specific role within this report, not merely as an industrial site, but as the location through which Ukrainian strikes generated enough consequence to force official recognition. The wording does not suggest uncertainty. It does not say alleged impacts. It says the strikes compelled acknowledgement of the impacts. That direct phrasing matters. The report also avoids broader military context. No battlefield summaries are included, no frontline maps, no operational casualty figures. Everything narrows inward toward this single development involving the Tuapse Oil Refinery and the Kremlin's response to the strikes connected to it. And because the focus is so concentrated, the report develops an almost investigative rhythm, one fact building directly upon another. The strikes occurred between April 27th and April 28th. The strikes targeted the Tuapse Oil Refinery. The impacts led the Kremlin to acknowledge them. That is the sequence presented. There is no need for embellishment because the central point already carries its own gravity, especially in the context of wartime narratives where public acknowledgement from state authorities can become a notable event in itself. You can almost sense the tension embedded inside institutional language during moments like this. Official statements often attempt precision, containment, control of framing, and yet the report here emphasizes that the impacts themselves compelled acknowledgement, meaning the effects reached a threshold where silence or avoidance no longer held. Again, that interpretation remains directly connected to the wording provided. No additional assumptions are necessary. The report itself establishes that relationship clearly. The Ukrainian strikes created impacts. Those impacts compelled acknowledgement from the Kremlin. And tonight, that sequence stands as the center of this developing wartime update. The simplicity of the report also contributes to its force. No dramatic adjectives, no theatrical phrasing, just a statement connecting military action to official recognition afterward. And maybe that is why the report feels unusually sharp despite its brevity, because it documents not only an attack, but a reaction that followed, a public acknowledgement tied directly to the effectiveness or visibility of the strike impacts. The Tuapse Oil Refinery therefore becomes more than a location inside this report. It becomes evidence of consequence acknowledged publicly by the Kremlin after the April 27th to April 28th strikes. That is the factual core presented here. And throughout wartime reporting, moments of acknowledgement often become important markers precisely because they emerge from environments where information is tightly managed and carefully delivered. So tonight, the focus remains fixed on that single progression. Ukrainian strikes, the Tuapse Oil Refinery, impacts significant enough that the Kremlin acknowledged them publicly afterward. And in the restrained language of the report itself, that acknowledgement became the headline. As the report continues to settle into public discussion, the central fact remains unchanged. The April 27th to April 28th strikes against the Tuapse Oil Refinery produced impacts that the Kremlin acknowledged, and that acknowledgement is the defining element of this development. Because wartime reporting often moves through layers of claims, denials, battlefield updates, and controlled statements. But here, the report points directly to recognition from the Kremlin itself regarding the effects of the Ukrainian strikes. That is the documented sequence. And the simplicity of that sequence gives the report much of its force. The article does not describe dramatic battlefield movement. It does not focus on troop advances. It does not present a broad military overview. Instead, everything narrows toward a single location and the reaction that followed afterward. The Tuapse Oil Refinery, a strike, impacts, acknowledgement. Sometimes the smallest chain of facts carries the largest atmosphere around it. And this report feels shaped by exactly that kind of tension, because acknowledgement in wartime communication can become meaningful beyond the words themselves. Governments engaged in conflict often manage public messaging carefully. Every phrase matters, every admission is measured, every acknowledgement is weighed before release. And according to the report, the impacts of the Ukrainian strikes reached a level where the Kremlin acknowledged them publicly. That detail stands at the center of everything. The report does not specify the exact wording used by Kremlin officials. It does not provide transcripts or direct quotations. It also does not describe operational consequences inside the refinery in technical terms, No production numbers, no repair estimates, no duration of disruption, only the fact that the impacts compelled acknowledgement. That restraint is important because the report remains entirely focused on what was confirmed rather than expanding into interpretation. And in many ways, that narrow focus increases the seriousness of the development. You know, industrial facilities connected to energy systems often carry enormous strategic visibility during wartime. Not only because of their physical infrastructure, but because strikes against them can resonate far beyond the immediate site itself. The report does not elaborate on that broader environment, but the fact that the Tuapse Oil Refinery is specifically identified in connection with Kremlin acknowledgement naturally draws attention toward the significance of the location. Again, no assumptions are necessary beyond what is written. The report already establishes the importance through the acknowledgement itself. The timing window also continues to matter. April 27th to April 28th, a short operational period producing effects substantial enough that official recognition followed, and wartime events unfolding over compressed timelines often create a particular kind of public intensity. The movement from action to acknowledgement happened quickly enough to become part of immediate reporting. That pace becomes part of the atmosphere surrounding this development. The report's wording also places Ukraine clearly as the actor carrying out the strikes. The impacts are described specifically as the impacts of Ukrainian strikes against the refinery. That attribution is direct, clear, and central to the structure of the report. The Kremlin acknowledgement, therefore, becomes linked directly to Ukrainian operational action. There is also something notable in how little additional language the report requires. No emotional framing, no elaborate descriptions. The central point already carries enough gravity on its own. A refinery strike acknowledged publicly afterward by the Kremlin. And maybe that is why the report feels unusually still and sharp at the same time, because the event is not being described through spectacle, it is being described through consequence. Sometimes acknowledgement becomes its own kind of evidence. That feeling rests quietly beneath the report's wording, not because the article says it directly, but because official recognition itself becomes part of the documented outcome. The refinery remains at the center of this entire development. Tuapse. One named location, one industrial site, and now one location associated directly with Ukrainian strikes whose impacts entered official acknowledgement afterward. The article does not discuss defensive measures. It does not describe interception attempts. It does not describe visual scenes at the refinery. The focus never leaves the central chain of facts. April 27th to April 28th, strikes. Ukrainian action, impacts, Kremlin acknowledgement. That structure repeats because it forms the entire backbone of the report. And in investigative-style wartime reporting, repetition of confirmed facts often creates clarity rather than redundancy, especially when the report itself is concise. There is another important dimension to acknowledgement during wartime. Public statements often shape perception not only inside one country but internationally. Again, the report does not analyze those effects directly, but the acknowledgement itself becomes significant precisely because it entered the public sphere. What had been a strike event became an officially recognized impact afterward. And that transition matters because reports of attacks and confirmed acknowledgement from state authorities occupy different spaces in wartime communication. One concerns the action, the other concerns recognition of consequence. The article connects both together in one direct line. And throughout this report, there is no effort to dramatize beyond the facts themselves. No speculation about future strikes, no projections, no escalation scenarios, only the immediate development tied to the Tuapse Oil Refinery and the Kremlin's acknowledgement afterward. That factual restraint creates a kind of broadcast gravity. The viewer is left sitting directly with the confirmed sequence rather than being pushed toward interpretation. And perhaps that is why the report feels so deliberate, because every sentence points back toward the same central reality. The impacts could not remain unacknowledged. There is also something symbolically important about infrastructure becoming the focus of public wartime attention. Industrial sites are usually associated with routine operation. Production schedules, technical systems, economic functionality. But during conflict, those same locations can suddenly become central geopolitical reference points. And according to this report, the Tuapse Oil Refinery entered that space following the April 27th to April 28th strikes. The Kremlin acknowledgment transformed the refinery from merely a strike location into a publicly recognized impact site. Again, the report itself establishes that transition clearly, and throughout all of this, the wording remains measured, controlled, almost clinical in tone, which in some ways makes the underlying development feel even more striking, because no dramatic language is necessary when the facts themselves already indicate consequence. The strikes occurred, the impacts followed. The Kremlin acknowledged those impacts. That is the complete documented sequence presented here. And by the time the report entered public circulation, the acknowledgement itself had become one of the defining elements of the entire event. It was no longer only about the strike, it was also about the official recognition that followed afterward. And tonight, that remains the center of this unfolding wartime development connected to the Tuapse Oil Refinery.